Welcome to the Sales Lead Dog Podcast, hosted by CRM technology and sales process expert Christopher Smith, talking with sales leaders that have separated themselves from the rest of the pack. Listen to find out how the best of the best achieve success with their team and CRM technology. And remember, unless you are the lead dog, the view never changes.
Welcome to Sales Lead Dog. Today we have joining us Matt Green of Sales Assembly. Matt, welcome to Sales Lead Dog.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
It's great to have you on, Matt. Matt, tell us a bit about your current role and your company, Sales Assembly.
Yeah, so Sales Assembly, what we are in essence is a scale service platform built specifically for B2B technology companies. Today, we're fortunate enough to work with a little bit over 150 B2B tech companies across the country. These include Series A venture-backed tech companies, big publicly traded companies and everything in between. And essentially what we provide in our scale as a service model for all these B2B tech companies is ongoing continuing education and development for their revenue teams. Everything from training their BDRs on effective negotiation tactics to working with their VPs of sales and CROs on emphatic listening or cross-functional collaboration. We provide access to talent because we know that many of these companies are looking to add headcount to their revenue teams at a pretty rapid pace. And we provide a really cool peer community where if you are a sales leader, marketing leader, customer success leader, or practitioner, you have the opportunity on a consistent basis to connect with your peers from across the country, across the ecosystem, and chat about what's working, what's not working, exchanging best practices, etc. And my role here is the chief revenue officer. So I'm responsible, as the name implies, for pretty much all things revenue within the organization.
And you guys really have a unique model, I think. And one thing that was really intriguing for me to have you on the show was really also that peer community component. There's a lot of value there for your customers. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, I completely agree. In fact, in large part, the genesis of Sales Assembly, a big part of the motivating factor behind a lot of companies in the very early days getting involved with Sales Assembly was because we had built this really fantastic peer community of revenue leaders, specifically here in the city of Chicago before expanding nationally. And our thesis behind launching Sales Assembly was that whether you are in a small Series A company and you're a head of sales, or you're the head of sales at a company like LinkedIn or Outreach or Yelp or Glassdoor, you obviously all sell different products to different people, but the fundamentals of how you do it and how you build your revenue organization under the hood, pretty much the same from company to company. So as a result of that, all these sales leaders and all these salespeople, they're all dealing with pretty similar struggles. So providing a consistent forum where if you are a revenue leader at one of these companies, having the opportunity to connect with your peers who are all doing basically the exact same thing that you are, just at a different, fast growing B2B tech company, that in and of itself has proven to be extremely valuable.
Oh, I believe it. I believe it. For yourself personally, what are the three things that you believe have really contributed to your success?
That's a great question. I'd say, I was fortunate to have, a couple things. Fortunate to have great leadership. In many cases early on in my career, great leadership, and I should say great mentorship, sort of going hand in hand. I've been fortunate enough to have been provided with great opportunities at companies, tying in with the leaders that, maybe despite a lack of experience in some way, shape, or form, would provide me with the opportunity because they saw opportunity for advancement, I should say, because they saw some other component of what I did, or maybe just as importantly, how I was doing business day to day,
Right.
that they thought, maybe in retrospect, maybe an error that I had a lot of potential. But they were kind enough to afford me those opportunities. And third thing, I think is something that a lot of people probably don't give enough credit to is just pure dumb luck. in a lot of situations, right? Happening to meet the right people at the right time, happen to start the right conversation with the right person. In any other life on Earth 2.0, maybe those conversations don't happen, those relationships don't form, and I'm not where I am today. So I'd say, yeah, those three different components, I think, really have played a factor in the relative success that I've had today.
Right, right. You're the first person that has mentioned luck as part of the contributor to success, and I personally believe that we all have to have a certain amount of luck to really be successful. And I think about that in my own career, that I'm like, wow, if I hadn't gone there and met that person, things would be so different. So yeah, that's I love that you included that. Tell me about getting your start in sales. How did that happen?
It started in large part, I guess, if you want to call it, by accident, and I'm sure you've probably heard that before. So in college, I was studying criminal justice with a clear, at the time, what I thought was a clear vision to work for the FBI upon
Hmm.
graduating. As weird as it may sound. And then, like a lot of other people, I presume the day that I graduated, I woke up and I said, "Hey, I really want to do this anymore." But unfortunately, I just spent 4 years, studying something that would be really relevant to that particular job pursuit. So, at the time, and, deciding really what I wanted to do, thinking back to the fact that I've never had a job that either in some way, shape, or form wasn't client facing, or in any case, or in another case, I should say, wasn't, my compensation wasn't in some way, shape, or form tied to some sort of incentive. Even going back to one of my first jobs, parking cars, working for tips for a living.
Right.
So the long story short is, a relative at the time said, "Hey, you're good with people. Why don't you start getting into sales? And more specifically, given your background, what you're interested in, and what you studied a little bit in school, why don't you go into financial services?" So that really got my start in sales, working for what was at the time American Express Financial Advisors, way back in 2004.
Wow, that's wild. What do you wish you had been taught in that first job related to sales?
I wish that, that I'm of two minds of that. I wish that I would have been taught patience, which is something that naturally I'll fully admit I don't really have a whole ton of. I wish that somebody had that either A, I was built maybe a slightly different way from birth,
Right.
and B, a close second, that maybe leaders that I've surrounded myself with had instilled the importance of just patience in general in me. Yeah, so I think that, especially working in sales, obviously we all know patience is a virtue in for a variety of different reasons, and also in life. And I think that, if I'm being honest, I've made some decisions in my life that maybe I wouldn't have made if I was a slightly more individual.
Right, right. Tell me about your transition into sales leadership. What started that process for you?
Yeah, it came fortunately pretty quickly for me in my career. Working, again in that first sales role, as I mentioned before, in American Express. As an individual producer, and again, this is an environment. Just think the movie Boiler Room. My initial interview was a group interview with 25 other people. At the same
Wow.
time. Um, so yeah, with again, very similar nomenclature about here's how much money you're going to make, and et cetera, et cetera. So I came out of the gate relatively strong, at least compared to a lot of my peers at the time. And
Right.
the old cliche in sales, you see a producer that's doing well. A lot of people have, I think in many cases, the misguided notion of, okay, well, that person is great at production. He or she is probably going to make for a great leader. I like to think that after about the year and a half in production, my leaders at the time saw in me, this, what I firmly believe it is a genuine desire of wanting to see other people successful. So that's really what attracted me to leadership, and I think that genuine desire in me, that again I believe was clearly visible, combined with my individual success in production. Those two things put together put me on the leadership track after about a year and a half of a individual contributor role, and I've been in some form of leadership ever since.
Yeah. Was that a difficult transition for you to go from sales to sales leader?
It Not necessarily, at least in if I'm looking at inward focus as far as my level of enjoyment. I Short answer is no. Whether or not I was as successful, especially in the early days, as a leader versus a contributor, entirely different story. I'd say
Right.
probably not. Like a lot of other leaders, it took me a little while to really get my bearings straight, and I'd say even still to this day, I have a
Mm,
lot to learn about
right.
being, an effective leader, a competent leader, which is something that I'm continuously working on, which I hope all sales leaders are in their
Right.
day to day.
Right. So let's talk about that a little bit. Where, I remember when I first got my first management position, I had this vision of what it meant to be a leader. And I look back now and I just laugh at myself. What do you know now uh, about sales leadership that you thought you knew back then, but you just realize now that, you're just flat out wrong, that whatever you were thinking, you were just so far off base.
Yeah, it's funny going back to the environment that I was, brought up in air quotes, in my first role. Leadership there, what they spoke about was big paychecks, nice cars. Again,
Right,
just
right,
think boiler room. So of course, my anticipation, and I'd be lying if I said this wasn't maybe part of my motivation of
right,
wanting to move into leadership quickly, is saying, great, I'm going to have the opportunity to get big paychecks, nicer cars, et cetera, being young and dumb in, early 20s. I mean,
oh
what
yeah,
else would I focus on? Uh, Obviously, I think both you and I and any other leader out there knows today that what is leadership? It is more work, less recognition, less pay, more stress. So it's the exact inverse of what, at least I was anticipating moving in to a leadership role.
right, right, oh yeah, that's so true, it's so true, especially like you just think like, oh, it's going to be so great, it usually ends up being so much more work. um,
Yeah.
the One of the, I think the number one job of a sales leader is building a great sales team. What are your methods or beliefs when it comes to building a great sales team?
I think I mean, the critical point really starts at the beginning, at the building, at the hiring, and, taking the step, even further back, the vetting of candidates that you're looking to add to your team. I think that is the single biggest mistake that leaders make. And the single biggest point of failure is not hiring the right people. And taking that a step further, either not hiring the right people or not correcting the situation once the fact that it's clear that these hires are not the right people, once that becomes
Right,
apparent. So
right,
I'm a big believer in making sure that you are taking, maybe more time than a lot of other leaders in your space, to vet the candidates that you're looking to add to your team, not only from a competency standpoint, but, and I know that I'm, speaking to a cliche here, but also from a culture. I would say not necessarily a culture fit. I'm a big believer in assessing candidates for a culture add. What is this person going to bring to the organization? How are they going to fit within the organization, of course, but what else are they going to bring to the organization from a culture standpoint? Maybe doesn't already exist.
right.
That right there, in my opinion, leads to a healthy ecosystem between leader and his or her team.
How do you measure that or assess that uh, impact that person's going to have, on culture?
Yeah, it's really tough, especially when you're hiring salespeople, because if there's one thing about, even not that great of a salesperson, he or she is probably halfway decent at selling themselves. The taking more of a group approach to interviewing, in that making sure that essentially, if you want to call it, setting up a hiring committee that consists of you as, let's say, the leader, consists of maybe a peer in a different department, consists of a peer that this person may not be working for but may be working alongside.
Mm.
Obviously, just collect a good amount of folks that you trust, that you believe have the best goals for the organization in mind, and have a good ear, or a good nose, I should say, for the right type of person that you might want to be that you might want to bring onto your team. Forming a sort of hiring committee of your peers across the organization, and making sure that you set the standard from the outset, that if you have an hiring committee, let's say, of 4 people, and if 3 of them are a yes and one of them's a no, then it's a no, right?
Right.
There's no reason for something as critical as making a hire, for both the company's benefit and, let's be honest, the potential hiree, the candidate's benefit.
Right.
You don't want to put them in a situation where they're not set up for success. You
Right.
really have to make sure that everybody within the organization that's part of this committee, as I mentioned before, might be able to identify blind spots that you might not be able to see as somebody that gets really excited about a candidate. Make sure that you're all aligned as far as expectations, as far as how this hiring committee is going to work, and what the end result is going to be. If a decision is a thumbs down on a candidate.
Right. Besides hiring too quickly, are there other common mistakes that you've seen when it comes to building a sales team?
Yeah, I think that, and again, it's probably a cliche right now. I think that leaders, especially young leaders, and I'll admit that I was guilty of this in my time, and might still to an extent, am today, is the desire to blur the lines between peer and leader.
Mm.
And I do believe that there does have to be a clear delineation between, hey, we're coworkers, great, and especially if you're in a position where maybe you were just, you've been part of the organization for 2 or 3 years, like I was initially, and then promoted to oversee a bunch of, your peers and friends.
Right.
Making sure that there is a clear delineation between, hey, that was, before, my new role, and here is how I need to act and operate in my new role now. And it's not just, it's, to be clear, it's not an ego thing. It is,
Right.
I have to have not only the best interests of myself in mind, I have to have the best interests of the organization and of every single other person within the company.
Yeah.
Especially if you're operating in an early stage environment, which are a lot of the companies that we work with. That's a lot of responsibility. Not leading the revenue team in an appropriate manner, not holding them accountable to their fullest potential. And that right there is a good recipe for destroying a business pretty quickly.
Yeah. Yeah. If you have two candidates for a position with very comparable resumes and experience, what becomes that deciding factor for you?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I'm a big believer in going with your gut. I think your gut is there for a reason. I think that more often than not, it's always right.
Mhm.
So if you're thinking about these 2 candidates, and you wake up consistently morning after morning, just knowing, knowing in your gut, like, hey, I'm more excited about this candidate, or this versus this other candidate. I think that's usually an intuition that you have to follow.
Right. Right. What do you do to cultivate management candidates?
Yeah, it's so identifying is I mean, of course, looking for folks that again, as I like to believe, maybe I exuded in my early days, looking for folks that genuinely have an interest and have a desire to see other people
Right.
succeed. If you're looking across your floor, or now in these days, your virtual floor, and you see some members of your team that are volunteering their time, that are extremely empathetic, going around to their peers, offering to help, in any way, shape, or form. Shadowing demo calls or working on scripting, role playing, whatever it is. That right there, on their own free time. That's indicative of someone who I think would be promising as a future leader. And how once you identify somebody like that, how do you cultivate them? It's I think first of all, being open and honest with them as far as, hey, I see you doing this. We recognize it. I think it's great. Here's an opportunity that I see for you as far as a career path.
Right.
What do you think about that? And going back to the expectations versus reality, laying out clearly, here's what it means to be a leader. Here's what it means to continue
Right.
in a straight producer role.
Right.
Laying that out clearly, and provided that he or she feels positively towards at least taking some steps or at least exploring that career path, then it is, essentially walking a fine line between making sure that they still continue their day-to-day production while also sporadically continuing to give them more and more opportunities for leadership, making sure that you're surrounding them with mentors. And I don't necessarily mean yourself as their direct line leader, but bringing in other people that probably have different skills and abilities that are complementary to what you bring as a leader, and providing the candidate with a level of support and encouragement that they probably wouldn't have received otherwise.
Right. Right. Thinking about the most successful person you've ever hired, what was it about them that you think really made them so successful?
Um, it was I have one person in mind specifically. It was just pure raw initiative. And I understand, of course, that that's not always going to be a silver bullet. But in this case, in this particular candidate, without going into too much detail, background was reasonable, competencies were reasonable, had a whole ton of potential. She had a whole ton of potential, which I saw. Her initiative not only helped her become extremely successful, one of the most successful people that I've ever had the pleasure of working alongside, but actually helped her get the role with the aggressiveness of essentially, pulling me aside and telling me, it's like, you really need to hire me, and here's why. And it's not very often that you hear a candidate saying
Right.
those exact words,
Yeah.
quoting her verbatim, "You really need to hire me." Combine that with everything else, yeah, is that just raw, pure initiative and energy that, yeah, that really put her over the top in the long term.
I've never had anyone say that to me. All the people I've hired in my career, I'd love for someone to say that to me. It's never happened. So I'm gonna keep hoping. Um,
Yeah.
but the last part about that, when it comes to sales team, is that I want to ask you about is motivation. Do you have any tips or advice for how to keep a team motivated?
I Yeah, I think that it's important not to focus on motivating the team. I think it's important to focus on how you motivate the individuals within the team.
Mm,
Um, and when you take a look at what are the different types of root motivation that powers people, whether it's sales reps or anybody else, it is a lot. Sometimes it can be money. Sometimes it could be career advancement. Sometimes it could be recognition, just kudos day to day.
yep,
And when you really get a good understanding of what is going to motivate each of the individuals that make up your team, you could start tailoring your broad team communication. If you know that, hey, what's really going to get these 2 or 3 reps going and motivated is not a spiff, it's not a bonus, it's just me calling them out in a positive way in their team and the CEO. Just
yep,
saying like, hey, by the way, Chris and Jamie, they both did a really fantastic job.
yep,
Knowing that, while also at the same time knowing that 2 other reps over there, could care less about an email call out, but it's all about like, no, I want to make sure that I'm top of the leaderboard. I want to
yep.
make sure that I'm making more money than anybody else. Getting a good understanding of that and tailoring your communication both as a group and individually to that, I think is critical.
I've read somewhere Number one reason people leave jobs is lack of recognition. So I've remembered that, and I try to incorporate that into my interactions with my employees, because I do believe that thinking back to when I was on their side, it means a lot. When you're being recognized, like you're saying, in front of your peers, in front of the CEO, that gives you always such a great feeling when you're walking out the door, like, man, I had the best day.
Yeah.
So that's awesome. Let's transition to talk about one of my favorite topics, CRM. When it comes to CRM, do you love it or do you hate it?
Um, as a salesperson, I hate it because it's admin work and I'm a salesperson.
Yeah,
So no salesperson likes, their CRM. As a sales leader, I love it and I can't live without it. Right. So
right.
it's, I hate especially operating in a small company like we do right now, where I'm, living in the CRM day to day. Hate the inputs, love the outputs, and
Right.
couldn't run the business
Yep.
without the outputs. So yeah, I'm sort of walking a fine line there.
Yeah. Why do you think so many salespeople hate CRM? What is at the core of that feeling for them?
I think that if you are a good salesperson, and this there's always exceptions to the rule, so there's by no means broad, and I don't mean to generalize, but I think that salespeople by and large are built a very specific way, and in being built, from the ground up in that specific way, anything that has to do with small administrative tasks. When you take a look at personality assessments, a lot of salespeople, they don't enjoy doing them, right? Which is totally understandable. There's also an egotistical component to it as well, where especially if you're a top performing sales rep, it's like, no, I don't need to waste my time doing this. You don't want me wasting my time in the CRM doing data entry. My time is better spent on the phone doing demos, closing deals, pre-COVID, playing golf and taking people out to steak dinners, yada, yada, yada.
Right.
Yeah, so I bet it's a combination of those two things. Just the salespeople, many of them are built, and a little bit of ego
Yeah.
that comes into play.
Yep. I believe it. For those top producers that are just saying, "Hey, I don't have the time," or "You don't want me doing that," what's your response when you hear that?
Yeah, I'd say, well, like with anything else in life, you could take a carrot and a stick approach. The stick would be, hey, don't do that. In its most simplistic form, you don't do this, then you don't get paid. If it's not in the
Yep.
CRM, it didn't happen, right? And I could go on and on about some stories that sales leaders, some really strict requirements that they built in, where even just what may seem as menial notes, even to someone like you or I, if those weren't logged correctly in the CRM,
Right.
compensation either was delayed or wasn't delivered in at all. The carrot approach, and again, this especially more relevant in a smaller organization, is empowering them to know, like, hey, this organization, our survival, and are thriving, depending on the stage that we're at, is entirely based on the numbers that are in here, right?
Yep.
It's not only the deals that you close, but it's also how you're forecasting, right?
Oh
If you're
yeah.
telling me that these deals are going to close next quarter, I'm going to make hiring decisions based off what you're telling me. We're going
Yep.
to make investments in the new tools that are going to make your job much more enjoyable, much more efficient. When we get back to the office, I'm going to base, how much money I spend on LaCroix and catering for the office
Yep.
off of what you tell me you're going to close over the next few quarters. So really, it's just giving them that sense of ownership as
Yep.
far as the organization as a whole is concerned. That would be my one tip on on the carrot side of the equation.
I love that. And I bring that up a lot when I talk to people that, when I ask that question. And I'm always puzzled as to why, when people are having that hard conversation, or what usually is a hard conversation with their sales team, where they're pushing back on CRM, is educating them about, guys, there's a whole downstream effect of not having good data in CRM. We're using it, like you're saying, for forecasting. We're using it for the people that now have to onboard that customer. We want to know about them, and we get that information from CRM and the notes you're putting in. There's so many things that happen downstream. Why do you think sales leaders um, are not talking about that? I mean, you nailed it with your approach. Why do you think people struggle with that?
And I know I've used this word a couple times, so I apologize for sounding like a broken record, but I think that ego comes into play.
Mm,
Sales leader, it's they, especially from all outward appearances, they may want it to seem as though um, everything's in control behind the scenes. I'm moving chess pieces around on the chessboard, and
right,
it'd be great if we had an accurate forecast, but I mean, don't worry about it because I have some magic that I'm doing here behind the scenes that you're not privy to because you're not, director VP level like I am, but you'll get there someday,
right,
so on and so forth.
right, right,
I think that it's just that level of ego that leads to that lack of
right,
transparency.
right,
And, I'm a big believer in transparency. Like, look, I mean, regardless of the size of your organization, this is how, all the way up to the CEO and the board, this is how decisions are made.
right,
So again, when you empower them, you're just completely honest with them in that regard. It usually just motivates them to feel as though they're a part of something, which is going to get them to be more inclined to actually take action.
right. Now, you've mentioned forecasting. I know that is a difficult area for a lot of companies to get good, accurate forecasts out of CRM. Do you have any advice for people that are struggling with forecasting in CRM?
Yeah, I would say, that there's a couple of methodologies out there. MedPick would be one example. It's really just making sure that the entire sales organization adheres to some sort of checklist where it's, hey, before a deal moves from this stage into this stage, we have to all agree that here are the qualifiers. Here are all the
Right,
boxes that need to be checked in order to do so. And as long as we're being truthful and honest and acting in that, I mean, of course, forecasting is never going to be an exact science. We wish that it was. I mean, it's always in some way, shape, or form that a best guess. But as long as you're building in as many of those qualifiers as possible, that is going to be a recipe for as strong of or as close of a forecast, as healthy of a forecast, I should say,
right.
as possible.
Yep. And I imagine having a structured sales process is going to help a lot with that as well. Would you agree with that?
Oh, 100%. And making sure that everybody across the revenue organization, again, is completely aligned as to what the sales process is. Again, all those various boxes that need to be checked, that's definitely going to be a huge boon.
Right. No, I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's usually when we do a deep dive, talking to companies that are struggling with forecasting. Those are usually the root issues: is they don't have common definitions, they don't have really a true structured sales process, or one that everyone's adhering to. They might have, well, I have my sales process and Tim has his sales process, but because you don't have that commonality or that standard across the organization, it makes it impossible to forecast. Um, what are your keys to success when it comes to CRM?
It's nothing too earth-shattering. It's really it's focusing on data integrity and adhering to the processes as we've been talking about, right? I mean,
Yeah,
making sure and it can't just be piecemeal. It can't just be some people within the organization adhering to these processes and procedures and adhering to this checklist. It has to be from the ground up. And I think that, again, going back to the entire concept of leadership and motivating people, empowering people to feel as though, hey, here's a good reason why I need to adhere to these processes outside of the fact that Matt, my manager, is telling me to do so.
right.
And I'm afraid he's going to crack the whip if I don't do so. Again, it's a couple different components that you have to piece together in order to have success.
Yeah, yeah. For those of you listening, he nailed it with his answer when it comes to success. It starts with your data, and then from there, it's process and it's people. So just a little tidbit of a quote there. He nailed some key advice for you. So I hope you listen and take, follow his approach, because it's spot on. Matt, it has been great talking to you. We're coming up here on our end time for this episode of Sales Lead Dog. If people want to reach out and connect with you, or if they want to find out more about a sales assembly, what's the best way for that to happen?
Yeah, best thing to do is, of course, go to salesassembly.com, or people are happy to reach out to me directly at Matt, M-A-T-T, at salesassembly.com. Love connecting with anybody, especially anybody that's, in the good old sales profession as we are. So yeah, I look forward to connecting with any of the listeners here today.
Yeah, and I had the privilege of listening to one of the peer group sessions, and for those of you listening, I was incredibly impressed with the openness of all the participants and their willingness to engage and help each other. To me, that's the key ingredient for a successful peer group, and Sales Assembly has that. They have it nailed. It really is terrific. So thanks again for coming on Sales Lead Dog, Matt.
Thank you for having me. This was fun.
Good deal.
As we end this discussion on Sales Lead Dog, be sure to subscribe to catch all our episodes. On social media, follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Watch the videos on YouTube, and you can also find our episodes on our website at impellercrm.com/Sales Lead Dog. Sales Lead Dog is supported by Impeller CRM, delivering objectively better CRM for business, guaranteed.